Kay last week said that we were here for a reason. And I didn't know at all that she was giving that talk. I request this novena, that is the surrender novena, that is exactly what she talks about last Sunday, surrendering to God all our sufferings, our concerns, our disappointments, our life, everything. Somebody gave it to me 2 years ago. It was in a sheet of paper. I requested. And I am praying it since 2 years ago. And this novena had been for me peace of mind, inner peace, trust, faith, courage, everything. Everything. The devil tried to steal our peace. So as soon as the bad thoughts come to my mind, immediately I start doing it. It was revealed to this priest Dolindo Ruotolo. He is from Italy. He's dead. He's going to be canonized. And he spent many hours in prayer. And he understood the importance of the deep connection with God, communication, communion with God. And God, Jesus himself, revealed him this novena. It's very short. For every day you just say, say here. And at the end you say, oh Jesus, I surrender myself to you, take care of everything 10 times. And that's what we have to say. When the suffering, and you will experience peace, comfort, trust, because you know that is not us. We know that is not us that are getting control of our problems. It's God. He got all the power. So I had some copies last night. Oh, wait a minute. When I get home after the meeting last Sunday, I have requested this novena from fullofgraceus.com. I didn't know it had come. I opened the mail, and guess what? So it's a confirmation of what you said. We are here for a reason. So I'm going to give you all a copy, and if you need to share it with somebody else, you can request it at fullofgraceus.com.
Thank you. So that's certainly a testament that the Lord is with us every single moment. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. I'm going to go through, I'm just going to go through 6, 7, and 8, and 9, and 10, and read them out loud. And then I'll just kind of talk from there. Okay, number 6 is think of others, actively love, and offer up your suffering. Number 7 is study the saints. Number 8, realize the last shall be first. Number 9, keep an eternal perspective. And number 10, rejoice in truly understanding the cross and resurrection. On number 6, think of others, actively love, and offer up your suffering. I'm going to start with my parents and a story that happened in my family. My brother was 14 and he went to play pool with some of his friends. And the guy that was driving the car was 18. At that point in time in Kentucky, the legal drinking age was 18. So they go over to a pool hall and he has a few beers. My brother doesn't drink. His best friend had a baseball scholarship to college that was with him. And so they played pool, the three of them did. And on the way home, they gave a guy a ride home. So they picked up another guy at the pool hall. They're driving home, and he has a car accident. And it was a bad accident. My brother's head went through the windshield, and it sliced him right here. The guy that had the baseball scholarship shattered his leg so that he was not going to be able to play baseball. The guy in the back hit his head on the roof, okay, but the driver was okay. So when my parents went to the hospital, and this is a difficult story, they told my parents that my brother was dead. And so my parents went home, told all of us. And then the hospital called back and said they had made a mistake. That my brother was not dead, that the boy in the back seat was dead, but that my brother would not live. And he was in a severe coma. And the doctors essentially told them that they absolutely could not do anything for my brother, that he would not come out of that coma, and that he would probably pass in a few days. And when I was in graduate school in my wayward period, my father would write me what he would call epistles, letters, and to get me back into the church. And so in one of his letters, he recounts this situation. And he says, the doctors did not know what to do, but we did. So my parents got their rosaries out. And my mother's side is very Catholic. So they all kept vigil over my brother's bed. And so there was always somebody there praying the rosary. And then 2 weeks later, he came out of the coma and lived a very healthy life. So now I got to tell you, after he was in the coma, he broke his jaw, and they wired his mouth shut, and he had a couple teeth knocked out. So he would have like milkshakes or whatever. But believe me, he was hungry that year, and he was meaner than a snake. He was my big brother. So he was absolutely okay and came back to himself. But they kept that rosary going the entire time. And that is the part of suffering where we want to be able, again, to have total and complete trust in God. Suffering is relative, depending on your circumstances. And you have to remember with other people's suffering, perhaps with your children's suffering, that again is relative. I can remember when I was in the 8th grade, a boy called my house, and I was not at the house. And there used to be in my neighborhood this vine that we would go and swing on. And you know how you swing out and you swing back and you swing out and you swing back. Well, when the boy called, my father said, she's not here. She's up swinging on the vine. Now you can imagine when I went to school, that Monday, everybody called me monkey, and you know what I mean? And when you're in the 8th grade, you know what I mean? So that you have to remember with your kids, their suffering, and all suffering is relative. And so that we're still talking about number 6. Think of others, actively love, and offer up your suffering. I have told this story before, but I will tell it again. My parents came down here when I was in my wayward period. They moved down here to get my sister and I back in the church. She was out and I was out. And they were 79 and 80 years old. And before they took off, they were going to get their kids back in the church because they loved them and wanted them to go to heaven. So they asked me to take them to 5:15 Mass. So I said, okay. You know, now I didn't think a thing about the fact that my father drove them every other place that they went. I just drove them to 5:15 Mass. Well, 5:15 is such a short Mass that you might as well just go on in and go. What else are you going to do? You know, so I went to Mass. And at the end of the year, you know, and I started going to the Mass. At the end of the year, my father found that he had inoperable pancreatic cancer. And so then I'm really back in. And, you know, and he was a beautiful model of dying. He was very comfortable with it. For weeks, all of my relatives came down and said goodbye to him. You know, would visit him. And so anyway, after my father passed, my sister was not back in. So my mother decided she needed to go to 10 o'clock Mass since I was attending 5:15. And of course, my sister had to give her a ride to 10. So then my sister, as of course, gets back in. So then my mother, when she dies, she leaves $500 in her will for herself, for Masses to be said for her. And then my Catholic cousins all added money in. So by the time we're done, we got $900 for Masses. Okay? So I'm thinking that the standard donation for a Mass is $25. Okay? I'm counting the Masses I have to go to. Because I'm just back in. I haven't been in too long, you know what I mean? And I know she's going to want me to go to a daily Mass or two besides a Sunday Mass. So I'm thinking, okay, I got 36 Masses to do. Oh no, 33 Masses to do. So I call over to St. Thomas More and I say, what's the standard donation for a Mass? And she says, $10. Okay? I go, $10? Because I'm thinking it's going to be 25. And I'm realizing if it's 10, I got 90 Masses staring me down in the face, right? She goes, ma'am, I can make it 5. I said, no, whatever you do, don't make it 5. And so anyway, in going to those Masses, it was absolutely the best way to grieve. You know, and when God is changing you, sometimes your soul hurts. You know how you work out and your body hurts? Well, they knew the story over at Thomas More, so the first week they scheduled us for 3 daily Masses and a Sunday Mass. Well, at the end of that week, I did feel like my soul hurt, because I'm going to 7 a.m. Mass. But again, it developed me in a way that it really made me a lot closer to God, and my parents, my mother knew that, and that is what she wanted. Okay, now, with studying the saints, who knows the story of St. Rita? You know the story of St. Rita Bernadette?
I know she's the patron of suffering.
Yes, she's the saint. She's one of the saints of the impossible, okay? Which is why I chose her for my saint. You know, because I figure I'm going to be pretty impossible to get to heaven, so I'm going to need all the help I can get. But St. Rita wanted to be a nun, but her parents promised her in marriage. And so she figured that that was God's will for her, so she married. And she had a husband and 2 sons. But her husband was rather a mean soul, very disrespectful of her. And also, he was a minor official in the town of Cathechsis, and it's C-A-S-C-I-A, which is where she was born. And he got into a lot of conflict. But she was so good to him. She never fussed with him. Can you imagine? This is a saint, not fussing with your husband. Okay. So she was so good to him that he became a very loving man. But he was murdered. And because he was murdered, because of the town conflict, her sons wanted vengeance. And she knew that if her sons murdered someone, then they would not be able to have eternal life. So in her love for her children, she prayed that God would take her children rather than let them murder someone. And God did. And then she wanted to join the convent, and initially she was denied entrance. But St. Rita was a persistent soul. And so basically she kept at it, and she was accepted into the convent. And then she received what was called the gift of the thorn. And at about 60 years of age, a wound appears on her forehead. And what it was the wound of a thorn. She felt like a thorn was piercing her forehead. It was a wound of a thorn from the thorn of the cross of Christ, his crown of thorns. And so she kept that wound, and she suffered with it. And as she was dying, she knew that she had complete faith in God. And she wanted a rose from her parents' garden. So this man says he will travel back. But it's January. He knows it's impossible that there's going to be a rose. But he goes, and lo and behold, he finds the rose. Takes it to her. And it's exactly where she said it would be. But that's how close she was to God in her suffering. And so what we are again looking to do is to join our will to the Lord's will. Now, one of the things that I want to have you do is a little exercise. But first, I'm going to go through what I call the 4 circles of life. As you can tell, I'm not a very good circle drawer. Okay? In circle 1 is the people that we can really rely on and trust, who will be there for us no matter what. So circle 1 is the smallest circle, because there's not going to be a lot of those people. But God is in circle 1, and that's the most important thing. And then we have our spouse, perhaps a few friends. Circle 2 is the people who will be there for us and care about us, perhaps people at the church or our friends or whatever. And they'll be there when they can, but they can't constantly be there because perhaps they live in another city, or they have a life that prevents them, or they have 4 children, or, so they'll be there when they can. Circle 3 is people that you're trying to figure out what circle they go in. And circle 4 is people that you keep away from you. Now the problem is deciding who goes where. And one of the things that you want to look at when you're deciding in what circle somebody goes in is how they use power over you. The Lord always uses his power over us in a good way. Ever had these points in your life where God's picked you up, put you down over here, and you can't go back over here? And all you can do is go forward in the way that he wants you to go forward, not maybe in the way that you wanted to go. And so that when you're over here, again, you must trust God is using his power over us in a wise way. So that's how you decide. Okay, now, I'm going to have you do a little exercise. So I want you to go to the second page. And I hope you guys have pens and pencils. If not, I'll see if I can steal some from Rose. Huh? Okay, let me see what I can get from Rose. Being the ADD person, you got any pens and pencils? Huh? Great. Okay. She's going to go get us some. All right. A.R.C. did the developmental stages of life. And what happens is lots of times in our life we have what's called developmental suffering, where when we compare ourselves to other people, we are not quite where we want to be. We also have developmental tasks. So, Paul, if you'll hand these out, and some people will have to share them. On this sheet of paper that Paul's handing out are the developmental tasks. So that from 18 to 40, it's intimacy versus isolation. So what you're learning to do is connect with other people, okay? Love somebody, develop a relationship, but that basically you're exploring relationship, and that if you successfully achieve this developmental stage, you will have intimacy, versus if you don't, you'll be isolated. And that basically the virtue of this stage is love. Next stage is generativity versus stagnation, 40 to 65. So you're doing your careers, okay? You're settling down with your relationship, you're beginning or raising your family, and you're being a part of the larger picture of life. And this is the virtue of care that you will develop if you generate rather than stagnate. Last one is ego integrity versus despair. And I'm about to hit this stage in March. That's 65. Okay? So that basically what you have to be able to do is find a way to continue to be productive and to be able to continue to accomplish things, but also deal with all those fun aspects of aging. Anybody know what I'm talking about in terms of dealing with those fun aspects of aging? Right. You know, so you have to define yourself differently than you have. And the fruit of this stage, the virtue, is wisdom. Okay, so on the other part, so you're going to look at where are you experiencing developmental suffering, where are you experiencing relational suffering. Okay, and sometimes it's hard because we have to put perhaps even family members in circle 4. Okay, so that basically, and then where are you experiencing self-imposed suffering? That in suffering, we do not allow someone to hurt us over and over and over again. We can love that person, but we may have to put a boundary with them. And that's difficult to do. And so that self-imposed suffering, or it's also if you're somebody that you're constantly on your own case. Okay? Love thy neighbor as thyself. God did not put as thyself in there for no reason. Okay? We are commanded to love ourselves and to talk to ourselves in a way that's loving and to encourage. So what I want you to do is, in a minute I'm going to have you do this and fill these out. The last thing that I want you to think about is the notion of reframing your suffering. If suffering doesn't have meaning, then we despair. So that if you think of it, hey, if suffering gets us to heaven, if it's our path to heaven, isn't that the greatest reframe? Hey, we suffer. Hey, and so we want to be able to engage in it and the saints really reframed suffering. I'm going to read you something real quick and then I'll let you get, but they were absolutely the best at reframing suffering. Okay. The Lord once said to Saint Gertrude, "The more you are tried and the more your way of life is disapproved, without any fault of your own, the dearer you will be to me, on account of the increased resemblance to me, which you will thus attain. For anyone who greatly resembles a king is usually very dear to the king. And I," this is Jesus, "lived in constant suffering and was opposed in everything that I did." When St. Matilda was suffering from a severe illness, Christ came to her and told her that when he beheld persons grievously afflicted and tormented, he embraced them with his left arm to draw them very near to his heart. Now, if you think about this suffering, okay, let's think about somebody that's chemically dependent. It's physiological. And it's a complicated process. I won't go through it. But it's truly brain chemistry. Now, if you go into an AA meeting, you will see many people who have suffered and perhaps lost everything. But they didn't ask for it. So sometimes people in your life that are causing you suffering in their behavior were perhaps they're mentally ill, or they're chemically dependent, or they're narcissistic. Okay? But there's not an intention to harm you. There is a disturbance in the brain. And that's a difficult thing for us to realize, is that it is not intentional harm. Sometimes you have to put them in circle 4 to protect yourself, yes. But God will take those people and put his left arm around them because of how greatly they have suffered in life. The poor, the disenfranchised, okay? The mentally ill, the physically ill, the handicapped. And many of you know people like that in your life. But you must remember, if they hurt you, it's not an intentional hurt. So there has to be forgiveness, but with a boundary. Okay, now I want you to take and do your little exercise, and then also perhaps see how you can reframe your suffering. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. So again, if you realize, and this is the most important thing I can teach you, that the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Where you're trying to get is the end of the line. So every time you suffer, you say, thank you, God, for putting me last. Because that's where you want to get. You don't want to wind up first. So many people in the world think of themselves as first. All you got to do is drive out of the parking lot. You can see who thinks of themselves as first. Hey, it's not hard. And the world defines certain things. You do certain things, you'll be first. No. What you're trying to get is last. And you don't suffer constantly, but when you get a suffering, you say, thank you, God. Thank God I got to suffer today. Thank God I got to sacrifice, because I want to get at the end of the race last. I don't want to be first. Okay, I'm going to have Carrie White come up and talk again. And again, we're looking at realizing the last shall be first, and also keeping an eternal perspective. And I'm going to grab my water while you do that. You want the microphone?
Okay.
Let's see, I think you stick it on your ear.
Yeah.
Yeah? You see how she's got it on my ear?
No, because your hair's in the way.
Oh. That's that ADD I got. Okay.
All right, I see.
So, can you get it off my ear?
Maybe I don't want to hurt you.
I don't care.
There we go.
I got a high tolerance for pain.
So, well, you're still connected, okay?
I'm what?
You're still connected.
Oh, I need to give it out of my pocket. See, y'all
you
see
do.
my ADD here? Live and up front. There you go.
Am I doing this right? Can you hear me? Okay. All right, so last week we talked about my miscarriages, but we're going to go a different venue today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my firstborn. His name is Jimmy. Some of you may have seen him. He's really super tall, and he's my face is on his face. Okay, so I had a pretty interesting Holy Week in 2003. Can everybody still hear me? Okay. So, on Tuesday, before we started Holy Week, I was over at St. Thomas More listening to a talk by Tom Neal, and I can't tell you what the talk was about because I was having contractions. And I'm sitting there, I'm like thinking, okay, we're almost to the end. And so we get to the end, and my husband, being the extrovert that he is, wanting to socialize, I'm like, honey, we need to go home. And he's like, do we really need to go home yet? I'm like, we need to go home. And he's like, oh. And so we went home, and little did I know that I had no need to rush home because it was going to take 2 days. And so we get to Holy Thursday, and so while most of you guys were probably doing Mass the Last Supper, I was delivering a child. And so Jimmy was born at 8:43 p.m. on April 17, 2003, and we had a very quiet week where we did, Stations of the Cross in a hospital bedroom, and we were discharged right when you guys would have been at the vigil, if you went to the vigil. And that's the only Easter I didn't go to Mass because I couldn't sit on the bench. And, we wondered, we said, is this child destined for something special? Because he was born during the Mass of the Last Supper. And he was, but not in the way that we thought. Because here we are, patting on ourselves on the back, thinking, hey, maybe we just had a priest and we were willing to allow him to be a priest and be generous. But that's not what God had in mind. And so around the age of 2.5, when things were progressively getting more and more concerning, and family members and friends are saying, please go see a doctor, we did. We thought, he's probably just reacting to his little sister being born and having to compete or finding his way, or, speech is late in our family, but our friends and family were right, and the neurologist told us, you're most likely looking at a child with autism. And so many specialists, the geneticist, tests out the yin-yang, MRIs, EEGs, all came back with no other explanation. And that at that time, that's how they figured it out, is by ruling everything else out. And so there's a wide spectrum to autism. So I'm going to give you a little idea of where my son fits. If you've seen the movie Temple Grandin, he's very much like Temple Grandin, but less verbal and loaded with learning disabilities. So in the 8th grade, when he should be in 9th, because we kept him back and repeated 4th grade, he has reading comprehension probably on a 1st grade level. He can read on an 8th grade level, but he can't answer the questions on an 8th grade level. And his math is on a 4th grade level. So my 4th grader and my 8th grader are doing the same math right now. And that was a process. We had many therapies with him. That was basically my whole existence when my kids were little. Instead of going to soccer games, we were going to therapy. And so my husband and I had in our minds, we have to do this, we have to do this, we have to do this, we have to get him to be neurotypical is what they call it, but most people would say normal. There is no normal, but neurotypical. We have to get him as close to that as possible. We have to help him with these behaviors. We have to get him talking. We have to get him back on grade level. And Jimmy was never going to get back on grade level. And that's something that we've come to accept. He's not high functioning. He's never going to be high functioning. He's in the middle of the spectrum. So around when Jimmy was doing 4th grade for the first time was when we really started to understand that this is not going to be what happens for him. God has another path for him. And so we were sitting in an IEP meeting, and it was the longest IEP meeting of ever because it was almost 3 hours long. I was working on a migraine. I was juggling my 4th child. And they're telling us that they need us to sign this paper that removes him from regular pupil progression, which is what you do to get a high school diploma. And my husband wasn't there. He was there, but he was not on board with the idea. But I was. And I knew we had to sign it. And the principal, who is at this point very exasperated, and I love her to death, under normal circumstances, she says, what do we have to do to get Michael to come around? And I said, you need to convince him. You need to convince him that this is the right thing to do. She needed to convince him that he had to surrender. He had to surrender that Jimmy was going to go to college and was going to have his own family. Because once you take a child off regular pupil progression, only 1% of them get back on. And so they talked and they talked and they talked with us. And in the end, we signed the paper. And that was the surrender. Fully accepting that Jimmy is going to live the rest of his life with us. Jimmy's not going to have a family of his own. Jimmy's not going to do the things that you expect children to do. But that's okay, because he's doing other things. So some things about Jimmy. Jimmy is the most kind, loving child that I've ever met in my entire life. He's unconditionally loving. He can light up a room if people get to know him. Jimmy closed the elementary school talent show twice with his special ability, which is that he can tell you the day of the week for any date on a calendar, even billions of years away. We have to use a special website to check him. He can come to your house one time and memorize, he'll know your address for the rest of his life, and he'll look you up on Google Maps and tell us how to get there. He went to the Philadelphia airport one time in his life when he was, I think, 8 years old. And to this day, he can tell you in the Delta baggage terminal in the men's room how many urinals there are, how many sinks there are, how many hand dryers there are. If he's been in your house, he can tell you what kind of ceiling fans you have and how many light switches you have. He can do all those things. They just started teaching him how to do computer coding, and he's picking it up very rapidly. So maybe he has a future in that, but maybe not. But what we do know is that he's come far enough that he can definitely go to vocational rehabilitation when he ages out at 21, and he can get some sort of job that is meaningful. But that really doesn't matter because, as Kay said, that's all pavement. What matters is when he was 8 years old and he made his first communion, which is not a given for children like him. He was the only child making his first communion that day. When my father fully announced him, everybody stood up and gave him a standing ovation. And he moved people that day. What matters is all the children at his elementary school that have gone on to middle school and will go on to high school with him do not discriminate against the disabled, and they love him. What matters is that he brings people to Christ in his own way, and at the end of the day, while I worry about his future because I need to protect him, I don't worry about him in the eternal perspective like I do my other children. And that's what matters. And I'm stuck. I got caught up.
Put this baby back on.
It goes under. That goes over.
This goes over?
Oh, wait, you're backwards.
This goes over?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then hold your piece up. Hold it up a little bit. There you go.
All right, it'll have to be good enough. So there's two more stories that I want to tell you, and then I'm going to have Paul Ebers do a little meditation with you. My mother had an eternal perspective, and so I'm going to read you a letter that she wrote. I found it the Mother's Day after she died. And, excuse me. So, she says, "Dear children, this is an until we meet again letter, so please don't grieve. In your own experiences, you have learned that time is the greatest healer. Your father and I had to give up our parents and members of our family, but that is God's plan for each generation. We know we have made our mistakes, and it was very hard to live with the remorse and your hurt. But with the grace of God, we tried to make you understand that you came first in our lives and were always a joy and a treasure to us. You were the sustaining influences in our lives. Our hope and prayer was that we could raise you to adulthood, and we will never cease to thank God for this favor. Now this is said as your only good Catholic mother can say. Remember, the 10 Commandments never change. And your faith in God and the church will be the strongest influence in your lives." So she really had, and she was the one that would always say, offer it up, so that if you look at your sacrifices. Okay. You want to rejoice in the cross and resurrection and in understanding it. I remember I was asked to head the Mass for the Jubilee 2000 at San Luis. Now, they hadn't had a Mass there in 300 years. And I walked in there, okay, and there's dirt, floor, okay, there's rafters, thatch roof, a table, and a choir loft that was so high I would have had to get a cherry picker to put people in. So I'm sitting there going, how in the world, because the bishop wants a Mass there. So I look. So I call the fire marshal, and I say, because I want 500 people to be in this Mass. Also, St. Louis is sponsoring it, and my budget is very limited. So I call the fire marshal, and I say, okay, how many people can I put in this church? And for some reason or another, he says, you can have 500 people standing, no chairs, or you can have 250 people in chairs. So I called the bishop. Oh, and I have to tell you a story real quick. The first time I ever talked to the bishop, he appointed me to a committee. Okay? And this was prior to, he had appointed me to sharing the vision or something. And so anyway, the first time I ever talked to the man, because I thought Father Mike told him to do it or something, I talked to the bishop and I say, Bishop, I say, did Father Mike tell you to appoint me to the sharing the vision committee? He goes, no, Kay. I thought of that all by myself. Open mouth, insert foot, the first time he talked to the bishop. So anyway, so I called the bishop, and he knows that he wants people sitting, so he decides that he's going to say the Mass at the door. So I can have 250 people chairs outside, 250 people chairs inside. He's actually literally going to put the table at the door. But then that would mean St. Louis would have to get tents and all of that in case it rained, and then there goes their budget and all of that. So I finally get down on my knees and pray, which I should have done in the beginning, but of course I got busy doing the task instead of praying. And I say, Lord, please help me. I say, St. Louis doesn't have any budget. I'm going to call the fire marshal back, and every single person that you can get me inside that church, it will save them money. I know I didn't pray at first, Lord. I'm sorry, can you please help me out? So I'll call the fire marshal again and I say, look, I want you to go back and measure one more time. And every single person and chair you can get me, let me know. If it's 260, I'll take 260. Because I know every single one is going to save St. Louis money. If it's 300, I'll take 300, but I want you to measure again. So he goes and he measures. And he comes back. And he says, ma'am, I have no idea what happened, but you can have 500 people and 500 chairs. And I said, thank you, Holy Spirit. Okay? But I couldn't do that on my own. Totally God. But the lesson in this one is pray from the beginning. You won't suffer as much. So, I'm going to have Paul Ebers come up and do a little meditation, and then we'll close. So you want this fun thing? So if you just want to relax and close your eyes, and
we know that God lovingly watches over us. We know that when we turn to Him, all will be well with us, here and hereafter. I pray for the willingness to remember that I am a child of God, a divine soul in human form, and that my most basic and urgent life task is to accept, know, love, and nurture myself. As I accept myself, I am accepting God's will. As I know and love myself, I am knowing and loving God. As I nurture myself, I am acting on God's guidance. I pray for willingness to let go of my arrogant self-criticism and to praise God by humbly accepting and caring for myself.
So we know that God gives us the privilege of being a part of His redemption of the world. And again, when we suffer, we want to offer it up for the purpose of saving the entire world. Or perhaps one person that you want to offer it up for. But that is God's plan. again, that we get so close to him in our suffering, he can kiss us on the cheek. And that is how we truly, intimately know him. And there is no greater privilege than to be able to intimately know him and understand what everything is about, what our faith is about, what our life is about. Now, last thing I want to say, balance your suffering with fun. I'm a great believer in fun. So that, and everybody in our society, we work, we go, work, go, go. But you want to balance it and being around people that you love and enjoy and make you laugh. Gracie, my granddaughter, whom I love very, very much, okay, we have this special little relationship. For whatever reason, she has taken to, before I was grandma. This year, I have become grandmother. So she'll call me, grandmother, I'd like to go ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Okay? So then I'll take her ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, wherever that is. Okay? But, she makes me laugh and brings me joy. Find that in your life. Thank you very, very much.